Hi everyone, my name is Whitney Bausman, and I am the author of the book Partly Sunny, An Honest and Humorous Look at the First Weeks of Bringing Home a Newborn. This week I am back with another chapter of our read aloud, and I have to be honest when I say that I'm a little extra excited for this one because chapter 4 just so happens to be one of my all-time favorites. If you're new with us, I hope that you will go back in the Partly Sunny playlist and start with us from the beginning so that you can get caught up. And for those of you who have been with us from the beginning, we are going to jump back in with chapter 4, which is called Tales from the Boob. Before we started together on the journey that is this book, I set out a list of caveats. For this chapter specifically, I think I need to lay down even more. Breastfeeding is just one of those buzz topics that makes people go nuts. There are proponents who will tell you that breastfeeding is the only way, that it is possible for all women with work, and that providing your child with anything other than what nature intended is to rob that child of immunity-boosting antibodies unavailable elsewhere. There are others who find breastfeeding off-putting, gross, and even offensive. Some women will run their bodies ragged, pay outrageous copays for frequent appointments with a lactation consultant, load up with milk-boosting supplements, teas, and even lactation cookies in order to breastfeed their little ones. Some, on the other hand, will elect a bottle from day one, basking in the option of shared responsibility in feeding. Many women would love to breastfeed and cannot, while others prefer not to and have the ability to do so. As a concept, breastfeeding is complicated and rather polarizing. While much of what I will speak to revolves around breastfeeding and pumping, please don't feel like an outsider if you are a past, present, or future formula feeder. Keeping a newborn fed is exhausting, period. Further, please know that I am in no way pretending to be a lactation consultant or trying to take away from the amazing work that these women and men do. They are champions for something that is, in my opinion, beautiful and pretty amazing. And also, holy crap hard, a monumental commitment on the part of mom, and simultaneously demanding and draining beyond explanation. Sounds like fun, right? Well, away we go. Jonathan and I were talking with one of our best friends, Cody, a few months back about how fascinatingly backwards humans are as a species when it comes to babies. Think about it. We're the smartest and most evolved organisms on the face of the planet, yet our offspring are arguably the most helpless, dependent, and slow to develop. When it comes to mammals, in the vast majority of cases, a mother gives birth to one or more babies, and within minutes, they instinctively figure out how to nurse and obtain milk. There isn't much of a learning process for mom or fluffball. It simply happens. Just like I know there are parents out there who have experienced nothing but rainbows from the first moment of their bundle's existence, I am sure that there are those whose experience with breastfeeding was much like the mammalian one that I just described. Lactation consultants will tell you, after all, that when done correctly, breastfeeding should feel natural and be pain-free. Despite this, who would like to venture a guess at whose introduction to breastfeeding felt quite the opposite of natural, easy, and comfortable? If you're new to the world of breastfeeding, the latch is how a baby fastens itself to your milk makers. From the very beginning, Clark wasn't a good latcher and had little to no interest in my boobs. I've always said it this way: Clark ate to survive. Unlike some babies who find comfort and experience lots of great bonding time while being nourished, my guy put forth the least amount of effort possible in order to meet his most basic of needs. For starters, because we were so enamored with his perfection and wanted to show him off to our loved ones as soon as possible, Jonathan and I missed out on the window of alertness that most babies experience immediately after birth as an opportunity for breastfeeding Clark. I kept myself covered so that everyone waiting next door could come say hello. I'll be the first one to admit that I waited too long, and I truly think that this encumbered later attempts. By the time I got around to trying breastfeeding with Clark, he was overstimulated and wanted to sleep. Further, my basic anatomy is far from an A+ when it comes to breastfeeding. If you're pregnant and have never before considered the size, shape, and length of your nipples, the day is coming fast. Apparently, guys, I have short nipples. Short nipples and tiny mouths, I came to learn quickly, don't always add up to simple breastfeeding. Because Clark had little to latch onto and couldn't have cared less whether or not he succeeded, my nurse recommended a nipple shield and added it to the mix. This multi-purpose tool, which is completely explained in its own name, a thin piece of plastic that shields the nipple during feedings, serves not only to protect my nipples from the toughening up that many women experience as newbies to breastfeeding, but also to add length to my vertically challenged buttons. The good news, Clark had more on which to latch. The bad news, everything else. Nipple shields are helpful, basic little buggers who bring with them a whole set of nonsense. First, albeit minimal, there's the added effort of having something to wash before and after every frequent feeding. Second, and still minimal, nipple shields can sometimes be a little drippy and messy. Third, and very not minimal, use of a nipple shield results in the addition of a breast pump. When a newborn is put to the breast, the little tugs and pulls on a woman's nipples actually stimulate her brain to release hormones that aid in milk production, milk ejection, and the recovery process of the uterus. While the nipple shield certainly has its benefits, the artificial barrier that is created between an infant's mouth and a mother's skin inhibits nipple stimulation. End result? Pumping becomes necessary after every feeding so that a new mom's body knows that it needs to keep producing and releasing breast milk. Before we even get deep in the glories of pumping, let's just pause to spend a moment discussing the logistics of feeding a baby. Newborns have tiny tummies and super new digestive systems. Basically, they require small amounts of food at frequent intervals because their bodies are learning, among so many other things, how to procure, process, and poop. Generally speaking, I think most people know that babies have to be fed often, regardless of whether or not they have or ever plan to have children. It's just one of those things, like knowing that having a baby means sacrificing sleep or that labor hurts. On average, newborns have to eat every 2 to 3 hours. I remember learning this in my childbirth classes, and before having experience at all in the realm of breastfeeding, thinking that it sounded manageable. My line of thinking was something akin to the following two statements. Oh, okay. So I feed baby during the day and then have like 2 or 3 hours to snuggle or get stuff done. Or, oh, okay. So I feed the baby during the night and then have 2 or 3 hours to get some sleep. Let's all take a moment to collectively laugh at naive, inexperienced me. Ha ha ha. Guess what? That 2 to 3 hour window we learn about, well, it includes feeding time. Guess what else? In order to promote milk production in the best way possible, you've got to feed fully from one side and at least offer the second side with every frequent feeding. Take a stab at how long a full feeding is initially. 15 to 20 minutes per side. Oh, and don't forget that you've got to burp baby between sides and after you've finished. And sometimes baby will poop once or twice or 3 times during a feeding and require changing. And if your baby is on the smaller side, like my 2 were, your pediatrician will likely push the 2-hour mark, especially during the day, and even emphasize that you wake your baby up at night to feed. And sometimes, be it day or night, baby is going to want to sleep through the whole thing, so you're going to have to perform all sorts of ridiculous feats to keep him or her awake enough to receive nourishment. We're talking cold washcloths, stripping baby naked, purposely trying to startle baby. Yeah, it's totally mean stuff. What does all of this craziness boil down to? Well, initially at least, it took me a solid 60 to 90 minutes from the time I started a feeding until I was able to high-five my hubs and say, yes! Only to look at the clock, realize that we'd be doing it all again, oh so very soon, and add, I take that high-five back. That took us an hour? You've gotta be kidding me. Remember how we talked about pure and utter exhaustion in the last chapter? So real. Brand new parents are expected to feed their babies 8 to 12 times a day. That's 8 to 12 of the demanding, time-consuming cycles I just described. Now that we're all on the same page as far as the basics of feeding a wee one sans breast pump, let's add in the joy of tacking on another 15-minute obligation immediately following every feeding. Pumping in general is a clumsy and cumbersome process, especially when you're inexperienced in taking it all in. Add into the mix your sleep deprivation and hot mess hormones, you'll be feeling like a frustrated and completely tired dairy cow in no time flat. Want to know what else is super tough to swallow? In all likelihood, your milk won't even come in until you get home from the hospital. So many of those initial marathon-length feedings and subsequent pumping sessions will result in only minuscule amounts of milk being passed to your little one or dripped into a tube. As foretold by my sister Ashley, the day my milk truly came in after having Clark was somewhat of an emotional roller coaster sort of day. If you haven't been there yet yourself, guys, the hormones are just shy of palpable. Imagine going to bed one evening looking rather like olive oil up top, only to wake up the next morning looking a lot more like Pamela Anderson. I remember Alicia, my oldest sister, coming over that morning to help with some housework, glancing at my impossible not to notice boobs and saying, "Wow, Whit, I didn't know they had it in them. That's impressive." You see, everyone, in addition to the short nipples God blessed me with, he also built me with bitty boobies. Just a few weeks ago, actually, I caved to the reality that I am unable to fit into any normal women's-sized bra. So I, as a 30-something-year-old woman, bought a handful of bralettes from the junior section. Well, the day my milk came in anyway, I had far more goods up north than I ever needed or desired. I've been trying to think of a good comparison for those of you who have never or will never experience engorgement firsthand. The best analogy I've got is a bee sting. Have you ever been stung by a bee and experienced that warm, rock-hard, tender swelling that comes with it? Okay, now picture that being your chest, times 2. Breasts engorged with milk look and feel a little like massive bee stings. Swollen, tight as all get out, and sore. All right, so your milk has come in. You're now experiencing a true letdown, which is a weird, almost electric feeling as the process of milk release starts with each feeding, and the baby is finally receiving more than a single drop of fluid every few hours. The sun is shining, the birds are singing, and all is well in the world, when suddenly you feel like you're going into labor again while feeding your cherub. What the heck? As we've already discussed, the havoc wreaked on a woman's body both during and after pregnancy is a very real thing. Because the uterus has been so well used and abused following delivery, the body has to work to return it to its original shape. How is this achieved? More contractions. Remember those blasted uterus checks? Well, besides the manual stimulation of a nurse's hands, there is something else capable of signaling the uterus to contract yet again: hormones. And what stimulates hormone release? Oh, right, breastfeeding. To any pregnant reader out there who may not have already known about this weird phenomenon, sorry in advance. Although these contractions are nothing compared to those endured during the actual process of delivery, they were enough to make me cringe and, quite frankly, get a little sassy with the guy upstairs. I understand that getting in shape isn't usually an easy, comfortable change. I mean, I'm pretty sure most swimsuit models don't earn their bods by sitting on the couch in their cozies. So I probably shouldn't have been taken aback when a notable amount of ouch was required for my womb to reshape itself. Seriously though, I felt like God was duping me. After you've endured the super significant amount of ouch that coincides with labor and delivery, there is no such thing as welcome pain in your lady regions. Even thinking about a menstrual cramp those first few days after delivery was enough to give me anxiety. Sadly, both your lower and upper regions will be sore and recovering when you make it home from the hospital. Even with the use of a shield for Clark, my nipples were crazy, crazy tender those first days. I literally squinted one eye and contorted my face in anticipation of his mouth coming into contact with my girls. My buttons looked and felt pretty darn awful in the beginning. Oh, and Annie? Well, the mere fact that she even attempted to latch onto my bare skin at all was a miracle to me, leading me to making the mistake of allowing her to grab on there in any fashion in the beginning. Are you curious how that one turned out? Well, instead of me heeding the advice to remove her from the breast and start afresh whenever the latch didn't feel right, as any and every lactation consultant will tell you, I gave a super premature woohoo if and when Annie latched on to any degree. I practically had to hold my breath because of how uncomfortable I was during feedings, and once I even experienced the joy of Annie literally tearing the skin around my nipple. Her mouth was full of blood, resulting in me jokingly calling her my little cannibal for the next few weeks. Strawberry smoothie, anyone? Sorry. But seriously, guys, who tells you this stuff? It happens. You know what people do tell you? That breastfeeding is simpler and more convenient than formula feeding. The line of thinking here is this: while your boobs go everywhere with you and without choice, bottle feeding supplies don't. I'll give it to you that formula feeding a baby may require a lot of stuff, like purified water, a can of formula, a bottle, and perhaps a bottle warmer. But breastfeeding, folks, it's just as complicated those first days. And before the lactation consultants out there pull out their matches and burn me at the stake, yes, after the routine of breastfeeding is established and both mom and baby learn the process, it is beautiful and precious. And so much simpler than bottle feeding or pumping. Until you get to that point though, which never happened for me with Clark, and took like a good 2 months with Annie, not simple. 2 basic requirements, right? Boob and baby? Well, how about the nipple shield we already discussed? How about nipple cream for preventing and treating tenderness? How about the bulky but totally essential nursing pillow for better positioning? How about a breast milk collector for those of us who leak from the non-feeding side? How about nursing pads to keep our clothing dry for those times we spot a baby in Target and start jetting milk? Yep, that happened. Oh, and how about our old pal the breast pump and all of its pipes, pieces, and plugs? This is real life. A few lines back, I divulged the reality of breastfeeding Clark. It never worked. Could I have made it happen, or could I have pushed myself or my guy just a little further? Yes, I'm sure. For us, however, for lots of reasons, traditional breastfeeding just never happened. After we were discharged from the hospital, I continued the feeding process I was taught, including the use of our trusty nipple shield and pump. Because breastfeeding never came to Clark or myself as second nature in the hospital, it was recommended that we follow up with a lactation consultant following discharge. We did this on more than one occasion. Jonathan and I spent lots of time showing the lactation consultant what our routine looked like, how I was positioning Clark during feedings, and sharing our concerns. She watched, assisted, provided wisdom and insight from her years of experience, and ultimately said to me after our second or third session, "Clark is just a strange feeder." Hilarious and true, but not exactly reassuring when coming from an expert on the subject. Because I totally 1,000,000% agreed and was so beyond frustrated that 15 minutes or more of feeding was giving my baby a whopping intake of 4 milliliters, I asked her if foregoing the baby to breast concept in order to elect pumping exclusively was an option. Her reply: breast milk is the key. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Even though she was quick with her response, our lactation consultant wasn't unrealistic and just as quickly explained that pumping long-term was a mammoth commitment, one that most moms can't sustain. Although I did not understand the enormity of the decision I was making, challenge accepted. Who doesn't love a good challenge, right? Well, on this one, me, apparently. This challenge, I anything but loved. Since I'm all about painting honest and accurate pictures for you, here's one. Pumping sucks. It sucks so much, in fact, that it creates this almost camaraderie-like connection among its performers. You can be sitting at a sales presentation with a complete stranger, for example, somehow get onto the topic of newborns, discover that you share the bond of pumping, and suddenly, you're friends for life. I kid you not, this real life happened to me. Just last night, in fact. Jonathan and I are in the process of purchasing new windows for our home and signed a contract with a local glass company at our dining room table last evening. The young professional who sold us the windows was very patient and understanding as our 3-year-old dictator shouted commands from the kitchen, where he was playing in the sink, and our 1-year-old dictator demanded more cookies. He smiled through it all and then shared that he and his wife welcomed a little one into the world only 3 months ago. We chatted a bit about the glories of sleep deprivation and how having a second child seems like such an improbability in those early days. Then, the topic of breastfeeding came up, and this gentleman shared that his wife is a pumper. An exclusive pumper. Naturally, as soon as my ears caught wind of these words, a whole new figurative window was opened. We vented and chatted and laughed and complained for several minutes about the experience that is pumping. By the end of our conversation, I was offering my own contact information to someone I'd never even met simply because she and I were and are fellow soldiers now. While I don't regret for a single second doing what I did for my child, I'll be the first one to tell you that this was the most monumental commitment I had ever made in my life. I'm not kidding. I think I actually told my husband once that I deserved a sizable gift for the sacrifices I made during Clark's first year of life in order to keep these rivers flowing. I mean, I semi-considered hosting a pump burning party when these puppies finally closed up shop. Despite the one super cool thing about making milk like Henrietta Holstein, which is that I could literally consume 3,500 to 4,000 calories a day without gaining an ounce, here is a list of sometimes comical, always sucky pumping realities that I actually faced. For 4 months, I pumped 6 times daily for 15 minutes each session. For an additional 5 months, I pumped 5 times daily, without any added time for setup, cleanup, and the dreaded washing of pump parts. It's fair to say that I spent over 22,000 minutes, that's over 350 hours, pumping. Awful. Once, after falling asleep on the couch with my hubby while binge watching some Downton Abbey, I woke in a state of delirium and literally cried because I had to pump before going to bed. I'm pretty sure Jonathan actually hooked me up to the sucker while I threw my giant toddler fit and repeatedly whined, "I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it." I am so super mature, in case you can't tell. Because I didn't want to risk reducing my supply, I got up at 3 a.m. to pump until Clark was about 4 months old, even though he started sleeping through the night at 9 weeks old. It took me getting sick repeatedly from a lack of sleep and a weakened immune system to finally cave and sleep the whole night through without waking to pump. For almost an entire school year, I pumped twice a day, every day at work. In addition to the personal stress this caused me, it was also a hardship on my coworkers because I was a school nurse and was the only medically trained employee in the building the vast majority of the time. My right to pump, in fact, was once a staff meeting bullet point. Embarrassing, to say the least. Pumping at home is bad enough, but pumping anywhere else, it just plain stinks. I can't even tell you the number of times I either forgot ice packs or lids, so the fruits of my labor were painstakingly poured down the drain or out the car window. All pumpers know that whoever coined the phrase, "don't cry over spilled milk," sure as shoot wasn't a lactating mother. Why bother if you don't have the supplies you need, one may ask? Well, skip a pumping session ever, and you risk lowering your supply or carrying around merciless melons. While sometimes possible, planning around events when it comes to pumping isn't always a feasible task. There are 2 specific occasions that come to mind when I recollect on this thought. First, I can remember being at my sister's house for a several-hour-long birthday party for one of her sons. Because I had no choice but to pump, I sat isolated in a room by myself for almost a half hour while the party carried on without me. I felt like I was in timeout, honestly. Second, when Jonathan and I hosted our annual Christmas celebration with our friends, I didn't want to miss out on the fun and excitement. Solution? I stood behind the pony wall separating our family room and kitchen and exposed myself from the shoulders up only as I pumped away. Brian, my best friend Kelly's husband, is practically allergic to the sight, thought, or discussion of any bodily fluid, so obviously this was exactly how he had hoped to spend his evening. As you can tell, pumping and we have a reputation. When Annie came to town, I resolved that I was not going the route of the pump again. Don't get me wrong, I would have at least tried it if I didn't have any other choice, but I was determined to breastfeed in a traditional sense the second time around. There were many reasons why I felt this way. Do you want to know the one that topped the list, though? Because I had a crazy as they come 20-month-old toddler who other, more polite folks called busy or active. I could clearly picture Clark climbing on my head, falling down the stairs, or drinking out of the toilet while I was tethered to an electrical socket for another million hours of my life for months on end. No, thank you. I was so resolved not to become dependent once again on the breast pump that I actually did myself more harm than good in the beginning with Annie. Remember my short nipples? Well, they didn't miraculously gain length between baby 1 and baby 2. While I did put Annie immediately to my boob when she was born, kept her there as long as she wanted to be there, regardless of visitors, and found that she definitely had more interest than her brother from the start, latching still wasn't easy or perfect. This wasn't a huge deal in the hospital when I was only making teeny tiny amounts of milk, but when the floodgates opened at home, I got swollen. Take a guess at what happens to short nipples when they are attached to a swollen boob. They get shorter. I can remember being so tight, so sore, and so frustrated one evening when Annie couldn't latch. I called Ashley, my sister, and my first line save me contact when it came to babies, and cried. I simply didn't know what else to do. And here is how our phone conversation went. Ash, just pump a few minutes to relieve the pressure and then pop her on. Me, I don't want to pump again. It took far more convincing than it should have for my sister to assure me that aiding myself a little bit here and there with my mortal enemy didn't mean that I would be tied to it forever. When I relented, winner, winner, breast milk dinner. For Annie, anyway. In terms of breastfeeding and pumping, I've got lots of complaints. There's no denying that, and I think I've made it plainly clear. Truthfully, though, what I gained with each of my children through these experiences was worth every bit of the effort I put in. In pumping and pumping and pumping for Clark, I learned that I was willing to sacrifice a lot of time and a lot of convenience to do what I felt was best for my child. And in overcoming obstacles for Annie so that I could breastfeed her traditionally, I learned that there really is another side to the breastfeeding mountain I simply hadn't made it to with Clark. After the struggle and after the learning, breastfeeding really is totally the opposite of gross and, dare I say it, easy. Some of my fondest, most cherished moments with Annie as an infant, actually, are the times that she and I spent together while breastfeeding. Especially because I had another, still super dependent toddler to take care of, I looked forward to our time, even at 3 a.m. Here's something crazy for you. Something that I never, ever would have said when I was in the thick of those newborn days. In terms of feeding my little ones, sometimes I miss it all. Regardless of where you find yourself on the breastfeeding spectrum, let's resolve to remove the shame associated with feeding our babies in any form. Do what you do because you love your child, period. Want to feed your baby formula so that your hubby can help you out during the day? Good for you. Want to breastfeed even though you're working full-time? Get it, girl. Want to consider bottles because you've given breastfeeding your best shot and it's just not what you thought it would be? Hold your head high. babies need nutrition to survive. And guess what, guys? Hate away, haters. But solid nutrition can come from a boob or a bottle. No matter which route you choose or are forced into, believe me when I say that you will experience lots and lots and lots of tears coupled with so much joy. And with that, we have reached the end of chapter 4. Maybe feeding your baby looks exactly as you hoped it would, and if it does, that's awesome. Maybe feeding your baby looks nothing like you thought it would, and you're still trying to find the other side of that mountain. Wherever it is that you find yourself today, I hope that my honesty and my humor reach you and your heart right where you're at. That you can recognize the enormity of what it is that you are doing and what it is that you are sacrificing for the welfare of your child. That you can be proud of yourself and give yourself credit for the work that you're doing. And I hope to see you all back here very, very soon for chapter 5.